I have not much to say because our next speaker really wants to introduce herself. She is from Wisconsin in the United States, which is nowhere near California. Please give a warm welcome to Elizabeth.
So I was talking to someone earlier at the conference, it was yesterday actually, and I told them how much I loved Rails Slim, and they said they hadn't heard of it. And I thought, I use this every day and I love it so much, so I thought I'd pull together something quick about it because I just think it's incredibly interesting, and we are lucky enough to be joined by one of the maintainers of it actually. So a little bit about me. I'm actually a current student. I'm attaining my bachelor's degree in software engineering in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm currently working at FreeZap in Hamburg, though. I'm a huge fan of Python, Kotlin, and of course, Ruby. So that being said, I've been told I have a very heavy American accent, so if you can't understand what I'm saying, just make a weird hand movement and I'll try to enunciate better. So, I love Ruby, like I had previously stated. My issue with it is, however, embedded Ruby. I can't stand the syntax of it, and I think it's very confusing. I had worked with PHP previously, and I used embedded PHP, and I had the same issue with it. And PHP actually has a similar solution as Rails Slim, and I really like Rails Slim a lot. It's a lot cleaner, it's a lot neater, and I don't have to hit the % sign so many times, which is absolutely amazing for me. So, Slim, what is it? According to the Rails Slim documentation, it's a fast, lightweight templating engine with support for Rails 3 and later. I had read somewhere in the documentation that their drive for this was what's the minimum required to make this work. And once we see later some examples of code snippets, you can see it's so much more, I don't want to say condensed because condensed kind of implies messy. It's condensed, but it's very clean. It's very brief and very beautiful. I think personally it's readable, beautiful markup. So what constitutes as beautiful markup? Well, here is some embedded Ruby. It has everything we're used to with HTML and such. It has those wonderful % signs and the angle brackets and such, and our beautiful yield at the bottom. Here is Rails Slim. I think it really condenses it very much. What we have here is, you can see, we don't need the little angle brackets to include the head. You can really just include links to such, like the style sheets right here, with just the equal sign. We don't need all of those angle brackets and the % signs and such. We can just use the equal sign. We can use that for pretty much all links. With the header.navbar and the sample, some good example of classes. We can really kind of combine them together, so we don't have to have this sort of class structure in between. We can really separate it with a punkt, and it still maintains the general layout, as we can see right here. So it still has that sort of form right here. But as compared to the previous slide, you can see very much it takes up a lot less room, and it still has that wonderful structure that we're so used to. So I personally think this makes it incredibly more readable. So right here I can tell already this is the navigation class. It's a div. We don't need to declare the div at all because we don't need to declare these sort of minimalist types. So we have this div with the class nav. We have this UL with the class navbar right. And we can see we have our list items right here, and we have those links to where they're going. I can see very easily, I read from left to right because that's how English is read. And I can see very easily I can follow this path of digression very well. So the power of the dash in Rails Slim. So I put together this presentation very hastily after I figured out that I really want to share this information. So it's not a huge code example. But with that dash, you can access anything in Ruby, basically in your Slim document. So right here, let's say I have my show method back in the controller, and I define a value called values. And I can go through that, and it's very similar to embedded Ruby, but it's very, it's more succinct. So I don't have to use the yield, I don't have to anything. I can literally just access it much like embedded Ruby, but I can do it more cleanly with just this dash. So it's more readable, I know what I'm doing. We use Rails Slim at work. I use this every day, and it's self-documenting code very much because I know what this is doing. It's going through each value. I don't have to parse through the different sort of syntactically ugly things that embedded Ruby really has. So some advantages, I think, are there are no closing tags, so that really kind of shortens up the amount of space that it needs in general. It's a lot less lines of code to look at. It makes pull requests very nice because you can see actually what's going on. It makes it very readable. There's no angle brackets, left or right, so you can literally just put what you want to put. I have the H3 right there, and I have the class name. It's very succinct and very compact. And there's no need for divs. That is a personal preference. You can put them in. So I could have put div.nav if I really wanted to. And there's no need for other minimalistic selectors if you do not need them. So this is in no way meant to bash Haml or any other sort of templating thing for Ruby. I'm not a huge fan of the %sign. I come from America, and we have a different keyboard. It's the QWERTY keyboard. So if I want to get to the %sign, I have to hit Shift. I have to move my whole hand all the way up to like the %sign. So I remember I was doing this project, and I was using Haml, and I was trying to write it, and it was like a hack day project. So it was time sensitive. So I was typing really fast because I thought about the solution. It was like the 11th hour. I was like this, right after the other, and it was awful. Couldn't stand it, but it's a very viable solution. I just think Rails Slim is more elegant and more succinct, personally. So let's add some logic. So Rails Slim can be used without logic. It can obviously just be used for HTML elements and such. However, if you want to use Ruby and you want to use Slim with it, you obviously want to add some deterministic logic, some if-else statements. So because I put this together very briefly, I made a very humble show method with one thing. It's called secret condition. So now if I wanted to maybe use something in Slim that had this, it's, again, very similar to embedded Ruby. So I can use my if selector just with this dash right here, and I can call the secret condition. And then because of that, I can link to this, maybe this internationalization. And if not, I can just render the form. So you can call a link to if you'd like. It's very clean, just like this. But we also have render, and they both come after the equal sign. And again, you don't need anything to preface this or end this like you do in embedded Ruby. It's just very clean, very simple. I want to render this. What I like about this very much is because, like I mentioned, I love Python a lot. Python, I think, is like someone thought of a sentence and they just decided to write it, and that's the piece of code for Python. I think Slim is very similar to that. If I want to render a class name form, I will just write render form. So some of the syntactical highlights, in my opinion, for Rails Slim. So it's also your left. On my left and your left, we have an example of what is some HTML right here. I think it's it's not very clean. It's not very aesthetically pleasing. My eyes get kind of lost. But here we have right here on the right side, it's the Slim version. So what you can do with IDs is you can actually define them with hashtags. So it makes it more succinct and it's more readable. So if I want a div with an ID of top div, we don't need to declare that div because it's a minimalistic type. And we can just use this hashtag right here, or octothorpe for more mathematics, and we can declare it right up here. We can declare the class name right here, right after the h1 with the punct. And we can say, here's a h2 element, and we can define the ID right next to it. It's very succinct and very compact, so we don't have to explicitly define it. We can use it implicitly. So it makes for readable code, and it's also more compact. So what if I want to use text with this? So here I have a very, very beautiful element. It's a header element, and it's an ID of my awesome header, and it has the text of hello world. As we saw in the previous slide, you can define IDs with these octothorpe, and you can put h3 and then the ID, and then after the space, the parser already knows that it's time for text. So you can just add the text right afterwards, so this whole 3 lines of code compact into 1 line. So what about tags? So here we have the On the left, we have the HTML right here, and we have an unordered list with list items and 2 links about it. With Slim, it actually becomes 3 lines. So we have our unordered list that we don't need to define with angle brackets, and we have 2 list items. Now this double punct right here, it implies that there is like a tag after it. So we can define the href attribute right here, and then we can just define the text right after it, as we saw in the div. So merging of attributes. So right here we have a Mahatu element. It has a class that's primary header, and it's a message. So 2 different words, so primary header and the class message. So what we can do here is there's 2 different ways to do this. You can put it after the ID, or you can put it before the ID. But if you have 2 different classes, you can put it after the punct. So it's just ha3.smallHeader.message, and then you can put the ID, or you can put the ID first, and then still, what Rails is very awesome at is once you see that there's a space right there, it actually allows you to put the text for what you want. So basically, all 6 lines of codes are condensed to 2 lines. It's very compact, very neat. So, what's Rails Slim once more? It is a way of compacting. It's templating. Basically, it's close to Haml, and it's a lot neater than embedded Ruby. And it's very readable. It's quick to write. The aesthetic is minimal. And there's no need for minimalistic selectors. You don't have to include div elements. I personally think it's easily understandable, a logical flow. So like we saw in the previous one, not that one, this one, I know what's happening here. It's very easy. You can follow this flow. OK, we're in the body, we're in the content, and then we can go to the other thing. It's very easy to read because it flows. And it's extensive, and you can actually write plugins and extensions for it. And it has automatic HTML escaping by default. So it's very scalable, very wonderful. And that is it. Is there any question? Are there any questions? We still have about 10 minutes. Yes?
What if I want to add a dynamically generated class attribute or basically any other HTML attribute?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
No, can you repeat the question?
No, I didn't hear what he said,
Okay.
actually.
Fair enough.
What if you want to add any HTML attribute that is dynamically generated from the backend server, from the Ruby standpoint? For example, I have a span of text, for example, and I want in one case it should be red, and in the other case it should be green. And I just pass a class name from Ruby. Basically, I add a script in Ruby that generates a class name red or green, and I add it to the class attribute in my span tag. How can I do that with Rails?
So, the question was if you have like a dynamic sort of element coming from Ruby and you want to include in your Slim file. Okay, so you can add it sort of, if I'm correct in this, you can add it, I'm so glad I have the expert here. You can include it as you would with like a equal sign right here, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Yeah, but that's the value in the tag. But what if I want to add an attribute to the tag?
Oh, you can.
Class attribute, date, dash, something, or any HTML attribute.
I believe you can add it with string interpolation.
Yeah, just quotes and the code inside. So hash code addresses and you get people to any Ruby. So
Oh.
it's basically like a string. That's the same as.
Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, but I'm glad you answered. Yeah, you can do it. It's actually very similar to Angular in its syntax, if you're familiar with Angular string interpolation. Yes?
Maybe just to complete the answer. So in case of the content sample content, you can pass, that's actually a method in the templating language, something like body is a function usually. It takes arguments. So by default you can just concatenate it with class names, but you can also say class is a keyword argument. So class, and then you pass the value of this class. You can just put whatever you need there as a string interpolation coming from backing on. So
Yes?
As far as I know, but I'm not a front guy, there's nowadays the possibility to define its own HTML tags for things like web components. Am I right? I don't know.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I wonder how this is handled because you said, or you had this example where classes, CSS classes, which you get in a few slides, or your first slide was code basically, yes.
This one?
Yeah, there you had, nav is an HTML element, right?
Yes.
So, okay, so any class is starts with a dot in this template?
Yes.
Okay, okay, so then I have a question.
So like,
Didn't have it right.
sorry, dot sample is like a class.
Yeah.
Sorry.
it's actually
Yeah, I have a connecting-
Oh, yes.
I have a connecting question. Have you ever seen view components, view tags in Slim?
I personally haven't worked with Slim for too long to know that, but I'm personally not sure. I'm sorry. Would you happen to know?
I guess it should be possible.
components.
Yeah, view tags.
You would like to run. You just, I will do it via Webpacker and just JavaScript pack tag and just inject the Vue.js code.
Yeah, what I'm having are ERB templates, and inside there I define view components as own
It's JavaScript.
tags, not as tags,
Snap. Okay.
and they get replaced. I guess it's possible, maybe before or after compiling through Slim.
So things are just potentially need to replace this main thing with your view. Right?
Yeah.
So that would be your like a hook.
And I would like to replace nav with my own tag.
So just in JavaScript that would
Yeah, exactly. That should work, yeah. That's helpful.
Are we good? Yeah, yes?
So, not a question, but I also love Slim a lot. And one thing that is also awesome about it is that it also protects you from some bad ideas that you could implement in embedded Ruby, but not in Slim. So, like conditionally opening a tag without closing it, that's impossible. It's awesome. It's awesome.
It's true. I agree.
Cool. If there's more feedback, I think we should move it up front, right? So we can break up this audience style. And if you want to discuss more, I want to invite you all to come up front. And I'm sure Elizabeth is around for at least the next 12 minutes or the rest of the day
That's true.
to discuss all the greatness of Slim with you. Is that fine for everyone? Cool. So then enjoy your break. We'll have one more talk in here, and then we'll see you over